Mr. Dawson.
Good morning, my lady. The next witness this morning is Professor Paul Kearney.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth, the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat.
Good morning, Professor Kearney. If I could ask you, when speaking, to try and speak into the microphone. It should pick up your voice, but be here for a couple of hours at least, I think, so if you could try and do that so we can hear everything you're saying, I'd be very grateful. Professor, you have produced an expert report for the inquiry, I think, which is dated the 9th of January of this year, is that right?
That's right.
And that is under inquiry reference INQ 000274154. You are familiar with the content of this report?
Yes.
It is your report?
Yes.
And your position is that this represents your opinion in connection with matters upon which you were asked to provide it?
It does.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask you some questions about your professional background. You're a professor of politics and public policy in the Division of History, Heritage and Politics at the University of Stirling.
Yes.
And you specialise in research on UK and Scottish Government policy processes, including their public health policies and impact on inequalities. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you have written or co-written 14 books, 97 articles in international peer-reviewed journals and 31 chapters in edited books. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you were a special advisor to the Scottish Parliament's Commission on Parliamentary Reform in 2017, I believe.
Yes.
And in 2023, you were a special advisor to the Scottish Parliament's Finance and Public Administration Committee, where your role included producing a report and giving oral evidence to inform the committee's thinking about effective Scottish Government decision-making. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you have also published reports, articles and papers about the Scottish Government and/or the UK Government's response to the pandemic, all of which I think are listed in your expert report. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I'd like to ask you a few broad questions about the scope of your instruction in preparing your expert report for us. Broadly speaking, is it correct to say that you were asked to prepare a report which focused on Scottish Government decision-making during the pandemic?
Yes, very much so.
And when you prepared your report, you separated the topics that you separated the issues that you were asked to address into a number of different topics, I think.
Yes.
And broadly, you were asked, first of all, to look at Scottish Government decision-making structures which existed up to and at the time the pandemic started.
Yeah.
And you were asked to look at some of the issues that arose as regards preparation for an emergency such as the pandemic in Scotland.
Yes.
And broadly speaking, that ended up covering your topics 1 and 2.
Yes.
You were then also asked to look at the challenges that were posed by the Covid-19 pandemic. Is that right?
That's right.
And you were asked to look at a number of areas relating to processes that go into Scottish Government decision-making during the pandemic broadly.
Yes.
And those included the role that devolution had played.
Yes.
It included looking at key individuals and bodies that made decisions.
Yes.
It included looking at key both administrative and medical advisory bodies in broad terms.
Yes.
It included looking at the challenges posed by the scale of the pandemic in Scotland.
Yes.
It included looking at decision-making structures.
Yes.
And ultimately, all of those many topics you brought together in your topics 3 and 4.
Yes.
You were also asked to look at the Scottish Government systems for communications, in particular its public communication strategy.
Yes.
And that became your topic 5, I think.
Yes.
You were asked to look at parliamentary processes by which primary and secondary legislation were enacted during the pandemic in Scotland.
Yes.
And that became your topic 6.
Yes.
And you were asked also to look at the issue of, broadly speaking, how public life and public services are funded in Scotland.
Yes.
And you were asked specifically to look at how funding worked for Scotland during the pandemic.
Yes.
And those matters were brought together under your topic 7.
Yes.
And you were also asked to look at, drawing all of these things together, whether you were able to provide an opinion on successes and failures with a view to providing suggested recommendations for the future.
Yes.
And that became your topic 8, as I understand.
Indeed.
I'd like to ask you some questions about the methodology that you adopted in compiling your very long and detailed report. We won't this morning, I should say, cover the report in huge detail. We will try and focus on some of the key areas, but I am keen to try and understand broadly the methodology that you adopted in its preparation. The inquiry, as I understand it, provided you with copies of a number of witness statements which were received from the Scottish Government's Directorates in the first instance.
Yes.
And subsequently you received additional Directorate statements which were by way of addenda to the original statements.
Yes.
You also received some additional Directorate statements on subjects that hadn't been covered in the first bundle.
Yes.
And you also received copies of the individual witness statements of key decision makers, former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon and former Deputy First Minister John Swinney. Is that correct? And in your expert report at page 4, if we could just have a look at that, you list 25 such witness statements from the Scottish Government and these 2 key individuals. And you took these materials into account in the preparation of your report.
I did.
And I think it's also fair to say that as one goes through your report, one can see that you had regard to certain other materials. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And those materials included materials relating to key strategies within the Scottish Government's decision-making process. Is that right? And that included things like the 4 harms framework from April 2020.
Yes.
It also included other things like the statement of the route map from May 2020.
Yes.
And it included another key document that we have referred to already in the inquiry, which was the levels system, broadly speaking, which was set out in October 2020.
Yes.
And I understand from your report that you also had regard to places where people have provided commentaries on those key documents.
Yes.
Which you also drew on to try to understand the Scottish Government's strategy during the pandemic.
Yes.
And you discovered, I think, when preparing your report in connection with these areas and on the basis of these materials, that there were in existence a broad range of other reports or literature connected to a number of aspects of the Covid-19 pandemic in Scotland.
Yes.
These came from a number of different areas, including, for example, epidemiology, care, vaccination strategy, and the like.
Yes.
And you, as I understand it, looked at these reports in order to inform yourself as to what other commentators in their specialist areas had identified as potential issues with the way in which the pandemic had been handled in Scotland.
Yes, I was very academic about it.
Right, and you make frequent reference to these, and in academic fashion, you reference all of these as you go through.
I do.
And they include, for example, the wide range of reports commissioned by the Uncover Group for the Scottish Inquiry.
Yes.
Setting out a number of proposed issues and questions for that inquiry to examine.
Yes.
Some of those reports relate to questions that are relevant to this module.
Yes.
In particular, reports relating to preparedness and Scottish Government decision-making.
Indeed.
And when you had analysed these reports and other sources, you developed a knowledge about issues which may exist and then addressed within your own specialist expertise yourself to the question as to whether political decision-making or structures may have played a part in these perceived issues with the pandemic.
Yes.
Could we go to page 122, please? This is Annex 1 to your report, where you list from page 122 going on for, I think, 17 pages of reports, papers, articles and books which you have considered as part of this instruction. Is that right?
Yes.
Are the materials listed here the basis upon which you completed your report, along with the documents I've already mentioned that you were provided with by the inquiry?
They are.
Are there any other important sources of information which you have used which are not listed in the report?
Only indirectly. Some of the sources I use as a proxy for a wide range of other sources. So, I mean, for example, you will see quite some self-citation, and that is an efficient way to refer to a whole other body of other sources that I didn't get into in detail.
I see. So you're referring to publications that you have authored yourself,
Yes.
but within them are included a lot of other sources that you looked at for that purpose,
Yes.
which you are effectively telling us you may have taken into account for the purpose of this report as well.
Yes.
Thank you. You have not had access to the Scottish Government's Cabinet papers, have you?
No.
And you have not had access to its internal documents relating to decision-making processes, have you?
No.
But you explained to us earlier, I think, that you had access to a number of key strategic documents which you have taken into account.
Yes.
Taking into account your areas of expertise, your own writings, the volume of material you've been provided to consider in the preparation of your report, and the type of material you have not had access to, do you consider that you have sufficient knowledge of the facts to provide your professional opinions on the matters you were asked to address by this inquiry?
I do.
Thank you very much. If I could then move on to some of the substance, as I say, I don't think we'll touch on every area that's covered in your extremely extensive report, Professor, but we'd like to focus on the ones that appear to us to be of most significance to the types of decisions that the Chair will ultimately have to face and make in this module. Am I correct in saying, Professor, that one of the areas in which you have expertise and have an interest is generally the area of government policy?
Yes.
And you define in your report, in the context of the pandemic, various policy problems which might be defined as the issue with which government is presented, to which it requires to come up with a broad strategy as to how to deal. Is that right?
Yes. I would say an issue is only a problem when a government pays attention to it and makes sense of it. So there's quite a technical definition of problem definition in this field. It is how they pay attention, how they interpret what's going on, and therefore what they think is feasible to do as a result.
Right. And as far as policy is concerned, as far as the area we are looking at, it really is predominantly to do with the strategy that was the overall strategy that was adopted by the Scottish Government in the pandemic. Would that be fair?
Yes.
And once one has developed a strategy, one has to work out a way as to how one implements that strategy.
Yes.
To deal with what you have defined as the policy problems.
Yeah. Yes.
And in order to implement the policy, the government requires to take decisions about matters on a more granular level.
Yes.
And it is normally thought to be good governance policy, is it not, Professor, that the policy, the strategy, will guide how those decisions are taken?
Yes.
And the systems in place aim broadly to try to maximise the quality of the decisions when faced with problems in order to meet the aim of the policy.
Yes.
Would that be fair?
Yes.
So in order to assess whether there is good governance, would it be fair to say that you need to assess broadly, perhaps three things. First of all, do you need to assess the quality of the policy which aims to provide better lives for the people of Scotland?
Yes.
You need to assess the quality of the more granular decisions which seek to put that policy into practice.
Yes.
And you need to analyse and address the quality of the systems which lead to the making of the decisions.
Yes.
And I think, broadly speaking, if I've summarised it correctly, that's what you've sought to do in your report, analyse all of these areas.
Yes.
You've looked at the quality of the policies.
Yes.
You've looked at the quality of the systems.
I have.
And you've looked at the quality of the decisions.
Yes.
Perhaps not at a granular level, but broadly.
Yes.
And you've tried to do so in order to assist the inquiry with reaching its conclusions about whether any of these things played a role in affecting the outcome and quality of the decision making.
Yes.
And your expertise helps us in that process.
Good.
Well, that's a question more than a statement.
Yes, it should do.
You say a number of things in your report very helpfully. You set out a very long section dealing with what you've defined as topics 1, 2, the background. And we've already had module 1, which has, as you know, because you draw on some of the evidence that was heard in that module, which has looked in detail at UK level preparedness, but has also looked at Scottish level preparedness. So I don't want to dwell too much, other than is necessary to inform the key elements, topic 3 and onwards in your report on that. However, we will come to that in due course as necessary. You tell us something in your report about, at paragraph 1, if we could go to that. A number of bullet points, which I think summarise aspects, I think, of your assessment of Scottish Government decision-making culture, I think it would be fair to say. And you say in paragraph 1 that devolution promised new Scottish politics, but delivered a Westminster-style system. Now, if I could just also take you to paragraph 10, thank you very much. And in that paragraph, you talk about the Scottish Government using aspirational new politics language to describe its culture of decision-making. What are the characteristics of this story of a new Scottish policy style from the Scottish Government?
So I won't dwell on this too much, but if I take you back to the 1990s, the push for Scottish devolution took place during a time of low faith in political institutions. So the language was very much that Scottish politics would be a very strong improvement on old Westminster politics, which was too adversarial, too centralised, too winner takes all and such like. So the Scottish Government built on this idea that the Scottish Parliament would be more important, the culture of politics would be more consensual, and the Scottish Government would operate in that context. And so it used to tell a story from 1999 that compared to the UK Government, it was more likely to consult with stakeholders and collaborate with a wide range of bodies, and it was less likely to try to subvert other forms of policy delivery, like traditional local government. It was more likely to put faith in public bodies such as local government, and more likely to put faith in the traditional public sector professionals to deliver policy.
Thank you, Professor. So just to set it in a broad context, the position before 1999, when devolution came into operation as a result of the Scotland Act 1998, was that there had been a certain amount of, I think, what used to be called administrative devolution to Scotland, and that a number of the areas that were subsequently devolved to the new Scottish Parliament after the 1998 Act had been administratively devolved within the Westminster Government to the Secretary of State for Scotland. Is that right? Yeah,
essentially the Scottish Government from 1999 inherited the responsibilities of the Scottish Office before then.
Yes, but the way that things had been dealt with up to that point led to, as you've already described, a certain degree of dissatisfaction with that arrangement for some of the particular reasons that you've pointed out.
Yes, and they were always accentuated in Scotland. So, for example, people in Scotland, they have a very long memory in terms of the Thatcher government onwards, and if you see opposition to a Thatcher government in the UK, it has always been much more accentuated in devolved government, particularly in Scotland. And so a lot of the language was essentially to say we need a Scottish political system that would protect us from the worst excesses of UK government control and interference and such like.
Okay. And you set out in paragraph 10 there on the screen some of the key characteristics of this Scottish policy style, which was put forward as characterising the Scottish Government's approach to matters in the period after devolution.
Yes.
Right? And you focus there in particular at paragraphs A and B on the style being characterised by more consultation and collaboration. You say that ministers and civil servants would meet routinely and frequently with stakeholders, including interest groups, professions and other public sector organisations, to help define policy problems and identify feasible solutions. It's the reference to the policy problems we discussed a moment ago.
Yes.
And you say at B that one of the other aspects of this was that there was more faith in public bodies and public sector professions to deliver policy, which you explain as meaning that ministers would place high trust in traditional ways to make and deliver policy, such as through collaboration with local government, and rely less on the top-down and remote performance management measures associated with the UK government.
Yes.
So there are a number of aspects here that were part of this style, which included greater commitment to collaboration, yes?
Yes.
With stakeholders in the first instance.
Yes.
But also by professionals and organisations that delivered government at a even further devolved level.
Yes.
And that there was a commitment not only to consultation with those types of groups and individuals and organisations, but to their genuine involvement in policy making.
Yes.
And as we said, policy making would then underpin decision making if it's delivered correctly.
Yes.
I think it's is it correct to say that this policy style has continued in different guises, at least at an aspirational level, to be the aim of the Scottish Government since that time?
Yes, they changed the terminology a little bit. So Scottish policy style, I think, would be a phrase used by academics. Successive permanent secretaries to the Scottish Government have described a Scottish model or a Scottish approach.
And if we could go to paragraph 22, please. And we see in this paragraph that you've set out, I think, a number of principles, and the Scottish policy style, I think, over time has crystallised itself in these principles being the way in which the Scottish Government would purport to go about its business.
Yes, this is slightly tricky to explain, this one. So the Parliament Committee was examining effective Scottish Government decision-making, in fact, not long ago, so it's good timing. And they provided a list of things that they associated with effective Scottish Government decision-making from their perspective and that of the government. And I turned that into 7 common principles that you would associate with being effective.
So these would be the sorts of things that the committee thought would be laudable principles and aims in trying to achieve good governance.
Yes.
And of course, every government is trying to achieve good governance, or at least that's what the people expect them to do.
Yes.
If I could just run through these include responsible and accountable government, And you mentioned there, it's mentioned there that there should be a direct link between the choices of elected governments and the citizens they serve.
Yes.
You mentioned the fact that it's important to have anticipatory or preventative policy making.
Yes.
Might that include the need to try to predict when things will happen that will require decisions to be taken in the interest of the people?
Yes, and also to deal with things that can't be dealt with immediately, such as long-term plans and outcomes. So that would come up with things like health inequalities.
Yes, indeed. We'll probably return to health inequalities at some point, Professor, but this would, just to understand the role of policy in this, what's being suggested by that principle is that it's important to have policies in place as a broad structure within which particular decisions might need to be taken in any given circumstance.
Yes, rather than dealing with crises when they happen.
Thank you. The third is power sharing and cooperation, and we've seen, as well as letter A, responsible and accountable government, we've seen power sharing and cooperation appear in the Scottish policy style definition you've already given, so those are repeated here, is that right?
Yes, but they use this, again, a technical term, co-production, which is quite a vague term, but it's supposed to give this idea that the government is not simply consulting with other people, it is producing something with them. And so that can either be producing policy-relevant knowledge or producing policy.
That was relevant to the point we discussed earlier, which was that it's not simply a matter of speaking to stakeholders, but actually involving them in the creation of policy.
Yes.
And the next is policy coherence and policy-making integration. Could you just explain to us briefly what that is?
So this is, I would describe this as just a very broad aspiration that if you produce that policy, a mix of policy should be coherent in that governments produce lots of different instruments. They tax and spend, they regulate, they provide information, they add resources. They should all come together to produce something that makes sense. And a problem with government in general is that they produce lots of different policies that don't match up. So policy coherence would be dealing with that problem.
Right, thank you. The others include evidence-informed policy making, fostering equity, fairness. It says or justice, but I assume it means and justice.
Well, these terms tend to be used interchangeably or differently. So, yes, all of those, but often people use them as an alternative to each other when they describe them.
Thank you. And the final one is delivering service as well, so the operational side of the delivery of the policy.
Yes.
And the broad proposition that you put forward, I think, at the top of paragraph 1, if we go back to that, please, the very first bullet point, was that devolution promised new Scottish politics but delivered a Westminster-style system. That's a conclusion which I think you have come to, or a proposition you are making. Is it correct to say that your summary here, or your analysis here, leads us to think that although at the start of devolution and since, there is an aspiration that all of these various important principles should form part of the way that decisions are made, that many of the problems associated with the previous system, the Westminster system, have started to manifest themselves in Scottish decision-making?
Yes. Could I expand on that?
Of course, absolutely.
Yeah. So I think there are two aspects to that. So one is culture and one is structure. So if you look at what we call the architects of devolution, what they actually produced, it was many of the same organisations and relationships that Westminster had. So, for example, there was not like a US-style division of powers between the executive and the legislature. You had the same expectation that the executive would be in the Parliament, would likely have very strong influence over the parliamentary arithmetic, would be expected to govern. And the main form of accountability would be ministers to their citizens through national elections. So the same sort of sense of high-stakes politics that would produce competition between parties rather than, a much more proportional system where they were expected to cooperate more routinely.
What were the sorts of things that had been contemplated as possibly forming a more powerful part of the Scottish system that might have gravitated against that outcome, structurally speaking?
Yeah, well, one of the principles of the Scottish Parliament was to be this idea of power sharing between Parliament and government. But I think that was never really fully defined, and essentially it was the same relationship that you associate with Westminster. The government produces most legislation, the Parliament scrutinises. So it's a very traditional Westminster approach, and I think that was always the plan.
Okay. And you go on in your report to tell us at paragraph 31, if you could go there please, something about something called the National Performance Framework. Could just go to paragraph 31, please. And if we could just go to, just have the page up on its own. Yeah, you're telling us here broadly at this passage about what you call the NPF, which is the National Performance Framework. Could you just tell us broadly what that is and how that fits into the way in which decisions are made in the Scottish Government? Yes,
so that really began in 2007, but it was supposed to be the manifestation of all these things we talked about more consultative, more coherent government. So the National Performance Framework had a single core purpose, and I couldn't tell you the exact wording, but it was sustainable economic growth. And then it had a series of other ancillary purposes associated with that, to do with health, education and such like. And the idea was that instead of individual ministers or departments being responsible for each part, all of the government and the public sector would be responsible for turning this vision into reality.
Right. And does the National Performance Framework continue to play that role? Has it continued since that time to play that role? Is it updated and adapted?
I think it does. It's not something that many people know about outside of government, but my impression is that if you're in the Scottish Government, you're very aware of it, and you're very aware of the need to pay reference to it.
I think it is referred to in some of the high-level strategic documents that you've looked at, Professor Kearney, is that right? Including things like the Four Harms type documents which informed the approach to the pandemic.
Yes.
So it seems that it did continue to play a role as in guiding policy and then into decision-making within the Scottish Government.
Yes.
You say at paragraph 31 that the NPF does not feature strongly in civil contingencies or pandemic preparation. It represents Scottish Government agendas and aspirations, not a specific decision-making tool.
Yes.
Could you explain what you mean by that?
My impression is that civil servants are expected to know about the NPF. They're expected to use the language of the NPF when they produced other strategy documents in a general sense. It's key reference points that they all use. But it is not something that is detailed enough to inform detailed decision making. It's not a blueprint that tells you what to do. It's a set of principles that you would use to inform your work.
So your impression of government decision making is that the NPF has a laudable set of principles contained within it?
Yes.
But that when it comes to the application of those principles to actual on-the-ground real decisions, because it lacks a mechanism to transfer those principles into results.
Yes.
That is perhaps a problem with the system?
Well, I would say it's a problem of any system in that a lot of the aspirations they have are in practice contradictory. So even the phrase that they used to use, sustainable economic development, there's a contradiction there in terms of the things they have to pursue. For some that would mean prioritise economic development, often at the expense of the environment. For some people, the word sustainable would suggest we need to change the way we pursue economic growth. But the NPF itself does not resolve those matters. It presents the phraseology to use.
Thank you. Another aspect, I think, of what you say at paragraph 31 is that the NPF is not something which features strongly in civil contingencies or pandemic preparation. Is that the impression you've gained from the materials you've looked at?
Yes, to me, when I looked at a lot of preparation documents. I don't remember seeing the NPF language. I think the closest thing you could get is the same sense of collectivism in the language of the documents, but they do not refer to each other in any meaningful way.
Because one might say that if the NPF is part of an attempt, a laudable attempt, I think we said, to try to define principles that will assist with good decision-making ultimately, that in situations of emergency, one might wish to have a means by which those principles can be operationalised quickly and effectively.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
One of the strategies that you looked at, and we've mentioned already, which is we've heard a lot about already in the first few days of hearings, which was actually implemented, which was put in place by the Scottish Government, was the Scottish Four Harms framework, which I know you've looked at.
Yes.
And just by way of reminder, this was a framework which was published originally in April 2020. Is that right?
Yes.
And that it set out a framework which required explicit comparison and balancing between 4 different areas where harm was perceived to be caused by the pandemic.
Yes.
And that those harms were the direct harm of Covid-19 itself, other health harm caused by the pandemic, societal harm, and economic harm.
Yes.
Is that right? And there are repeated references to the Four Harms framework in the witness statements of the Scottish Government. Is that not right?
Yes.
The ones that we provided you with from the Directorate.
Indeed.
And could we go to paragraph 163, please? Here, is it correct that you tell us that because of the high uncertainty about how to deal with the pandemic and the likely impact of various decisions, this meant that the Four Harms framework was, much like the National Performance Framework, an important reference point to general principles rather than a detailed guide to decision-making during the pandemic?
Yes.
And you explain again, as you had with the National Performance Framework, I think, that the Four Harms was not itself a decision-making tool in the pandemic or specific decision-making tool. Is that right?
Yes. My impression is that it is mostly a statement of the problem. It's not a statement of the solution. So it essentially says there are 4 main harms that we need to take into account, and there will always be trade-offs between trying to reduce one harm in relation to the other. So the classic was a lockdown would reduce Covid-19 harm, but it would also have a knock-on effect for the other 3. There would be less access to the NHS, there would be more social isolation, and there would be a problem of economic activity. So it was essentially a way to describe the 4 key harms that they wanted to pay attention to at any one time.
Does this mean that it's perhaps again a laudable statement of intent or approach, but it doesn't set out any means by which ultimate decisions should be made in a scientific or evidence-based way?
That's right. I think it's just a very general way of focusing the mind on the 4 key objectives.
And it would mean that, I think you say here, that they would require still a significant degree of judgment, perhaps subjective judgment, to be applied when it comes to actually making the decisions.
I would say profoundly so. I think there's no framework like this that could tell a minister when to lock down or not, who to favour, to favour economic growth or COVID-19 reduction in harm. It does not. It is. I don't think it was ever really designed to guide decision making that way, apart from just to give people the things that they remind them of the trade-offs, remind them of the principles that they signed up to.
So I think if I heard you correctly, your position was that it helped define the problem, but didn't help with the solution.
Yes.
Thank you. And in your, you give some attention to this in your report very helpfully. I won't go through every aspect of it, but I think that you suggest that it was perhaps, on your assessment, not a strong feature of decisions as regards certainly the first lockdown, because it didn't exist at that time.
Yes.
But subsequent decision-making, including, for example, the decision to have the second lockdown.
Yes, I think the only thing that stood out was one document said that, so I mean in Scotland everything is compared with the UK government, and the one document stated we used this framework more purposefully than the UK government. So what I took that to mean is all ministers, UK and devolved, are trying to make this judgment between reducing Covid-19 and dealing with social and economic harm. And I think their statement is they have a document and a way of working that makes that, that focuses the mind on that trade-off. And that doesn't mean that other governments are not engaged with the same trade-offs and decisions.
Okay, thank you. We've talked about a number of things which might be described as setting the scene or aspirational. Would that be right? And the characteristic of the various things we've looked at so far?
Yes.
And you've also drawn us to the first bullet point conclusion, paragraph 1, that there has been a characteristic of Scottish Government decision-making over years, that it aspires to be different from the Westminster system, but often fails in that aspiration. Is that correct?
Yes.
And is it your evidence that the decision-making structures within the Scottish Government, as far as you could glean relating to the pandemic in the paperwork with which you were provided, which emanated predominantly from the Scottish Government, shared some of the features that were criticised, I suppose, in the UK Government decision-making structures, such as it being centralised and top-down?
Yes, I hesitated there. I would say given the system they have, there's an almost inbuilt tendency towards top-down policymaking. It's a Scottish version, and it may be less top-down, more consensual, but the thing that I always had in mind is the comparison with the UK is often unhelpful, because to say that something is better does not make it good. And to say that it's less top-down does not make it not top-down. So I think the reference point is useful, but it can also distract us from what governments actually do.
One of the things you refer to from a structural perspective in your report very helpfully, and about which there's an enormous amount of very complex information, which I think I have to try to present in due course, is the Directorate structure of the Scottish Government. Is this a structure which has come in, broadly speaking, since the governments have become SNP dominated, or either exclusively SNP led administration since 2007?
Yes, I should say the way the former Permanent Secretary at the time described this meeting of minds between the Scottish Government and the SNP government. They had the same idea about what to do. And the idea was you would have fewer ministers, and you would have a departmental system that became a directorate system that was designed to be much more joined up and relating to the NPF, and much less subject to the problems associated with Westminster, that departments were much more built based on sectors, and they existed in silos without talking to each other. So they both had this idea that they could have a coherent group of ministers and a coherent collection of directorates that could then talk to each other in a much more meaningful way.
So you said there, I think, that you described a meeting of minds between the Scottish Government and the SNP government.
Sorry. Okay, so I should say...
Did you mean the Scottish Civil Service, or did you mean this UK government being the first one?
Okay, so I should... there's taken for granted things. In my mind, the Scottish Government describes the organisation that contains ministers and civil servants. So then I was describing the Scottish Government as largely the civil servants. So that would be John Elvidge and colleagues.
Yes. And you were discussing the prominent civil servant having given some commentary on what had happened over that period, I think.
Yes.
And you go into more detail about this in the report. And that there had been, I think, please correct me if I'm wrong about this, an impetus or a desire on the part of the new SNP administration to try to achieve this directorate structure broadly for the reasons you've outlined, that it was thought that it would work better than the rigid departmental structure which had been and is characteristic perhaps of the UK government and had been characteristic of the Scottish government up till that point.
Yes, and I think it needed that meeting of minds between ministers and civil servants, because it was a substantial reform, essentially abolishing what they called departments, introducing a far larger number of directorates. It required support from both sides.
Mm-hmm. So there was, I suppose, the policy, if you like, was to try to introduce a new system, but there needed to be buy-in from those who would be part of that system, and that was the position at 2007.
Yes.
And the directorate system had these goals, and in particular, if you referred to the fact that it seeks to minimise rigidity and departments working in silos, is that correct?
Yes.
And one sees sometimes a phrase which we rather use in the inquiry as well, I'm afraid, is a degree of trying to minimise cross-cutting problems that would arise in different areas and try to work together to solve them. Is that right?
Yes, and I would say almost every problem is cross-cutting in some way. So this is an approach that makes sense.
And in your evidence at paragraph 89.2, if we could go to that. This is in the section where you are still talking about some of the Module 1 evidence and the background structures which existed to try to deal with emergency situations in the Scottish system. You referred in particular to some evidence on this subject that was given by Gillian Russell. Could you explain the role that she played and why it was that you thought that the description that she gave of this system was of interest as far as whether this directorate system functioned well or not?
Yeah, so this is a little bit simplistic, but as I understand it, all serving Scottish Government civil servants make reference to this kind of language about being joined up and about having a good directorate system. So you would expect this kind of testimony where there was very much an emphasis on doing things in a Scottish way, a Scottish Government way, with reference to a wider culture and set of expectations. And you normally expect there to be a story that this works well. And
as far as you're concerned, did you see in the materials with which you were provided evidence of this aspirational approach to the directorate structure achieving the aims which it set out to achieve?
Yeah, I would say that on paper, or if you were to listen to someone describing what they do, it would look like it made sense. It's very difficult to relate that to what actually happens.
Okay, and that would apply, obviously the paperwork I'm referring to is paperwork related to the way that decisions were made in the pandemic.
Yes.
So your position, is your evidence that this is an example, again, I think, of a structure which seeks to try and have a positive aim, but of which there is little evidence that it actually has a positive effect?
Yes, I mean, I'm keen to stress, and this phrase, evidence of absence is not absence of evidence, or either or. So what I'm struck by is when I read Scottish Government documents or accounts, they very much emphasise their aspirations, their structures, their strategies, and they do not really emphasise the more fine-grained decisions or their impacts. It's very much a kind of general story about how this is supposed to work. Mm-hmm.
And just to be clear, in case there's any doubt about it, the documents that I'm referring to upon which you've undertaken this analysis. These are the corporate statements and a couple of individual statements which have emanated from the inquiry's investigation into how decisions were taken.
Yes.
So it would be fair to say that if there were examples which you have suggested are absent of the way in which this directorate structure did achieve the aim which it set out to achieve, one might expect them to appear within that very large corporate body of evidence.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect the Scottish Government to be sitting on, a secret stash of documents exhibiting their success.
You refer in your report also to a number of organisational changes which took place during the course of the pandemic. If we go to paragraph 141. Yes, in paragraph 142, under the heading, the reorganisation of directorates to coordinate a Scottish Government response to Covid-19. We've touched on some of this in the opening statement, and we'll address some of the detail with some other witnesses in due course. But you set out there that, broadly speaking, there was a reorganisation based on the materials that you were given, where within the directorate structure, a number of new directorate bodies were created to deal with the pandemic at various different times and in various different places.
Yes.
Just to be clear, and in the hope that I understand this, there are, I think, what are called directorates general, which are overarching bodies that within them contain a number of sub-directorates that are called directorates.
Yeah, it is a confusing language, and I think that the Scottish Government uses the language of families of directorates. So I think a family, a well-working family, I think that was what they're trying to project, and that this is a collection of directorates which interact with each other. They are separate organisationally, but they interact with each other as part of a wider Directorate General led by a Director General. Right.
So we see there at 142.1, for example, the Directorate General for Constitutional External Affairs. That would be one of the family definitions. And then within that, there would be a number of members of the family that would be directorates underneath that.
Yes.
And I think you point in particular to the fact that within that Directorate General, which I think it's fair to say was certainly one of, if not the lead Directorate General in relation to the pandemic, there were a number of new bodies and directorates and structures created while the pandemic was actually happening.
Yes. I should say that I would express uncertainty. It's very difficult to know the extent of the reorganisation. My sense is the documents that I read, that we referred to, provide a lot of detail on various name changes to directorates, and they list the director in each case. It's very difficult to know if the name change represents or symbolises a functional change, or if they're simply rebranding what they do with different names.
We can explore that factual matter, and no doubt we will have to with other witnesses in due course, Professor Kearney. But within that particular Directorate General, and also another one, which was the Health and Social Care Directorate General, there appeared to be a number of new bodies, new advisory structures created. Is that broadly your understanding?
Yes, and I think in some other cases the role is much clearer because the directorate is new and the topic is new. So I think, for example, a directorate for I should remember them all, but say a directorate for testing and tracing or something like that. It's clearly been established to do something new.
Yes.
Where some of them have been rebranded to repurpose what they do.
Yes. And with can we look at paragraph 141, please? Again, your position was, I think, there around about halfway through, you say, however, the Scottish Government provides limited evidence that this system of decision-making was more effective during its response to Covid-19, partly because the inquiry did not ask to do it so explicitly. As far as that is concerned, where does that second comment emanate from, the one in brackets?
Okay, I'm smiling a bit here. So I produced 4 drafts of my report. The final draft was the 4th draft. The second draft was in response to the inquiry team comments, very constructive and helpful. The final draft was produced after detailed comment from core participants, primarily from Scottish Government participants. I joked to the team that it was like they were marking my homework, and that was often very good because they pointed out some inaccuracies. But this one, I think, summed up for me the problem the inquiry has in getting information from the Scottish Government, because my impression is it is only providing answers to the questions posed, and it's never going any further than that. And so I think that was feedback from one person in response to a comment that I'd made in a previous draft, which was the Scottish Government doesn't provide much evidence on X, Y, and Z. The response from them was, well, you didn't ask us to give you that evidence.
Okay. So that comment, to be clear, came from the Scottish Government, is that right?
Yes.
And the Scottish Government's comment was that the reason why the Scottish Government documentation had provided limited evidence that this system of decision-making was more effective during its response to COVID-19 was because the inquiry hadn't asked it to do so.
Yes.
As far as the second part is concerned, based on what you have seen, and putting aside for the moment the question of whether that they had been asked that or not, your assessment was, I think, most of its relevant written evidence to which I have had access describes organisational changes rather than their effectiveness.
Yes.
So your impression was that although there was a lot about how things had been moved around and rebranded, there wasn't an awful lot of discussion about how that had helped the people of Scotland ultimately.
Indeed.
Broadly speaking, based on your experience of the way in which governments are structured, policy is formulated and implemented to try and maximise the effectiveness of decisions, would you, and bearing in mind, of course, that you have conducted a very extensive analysis of the pre-pandemic situation in Scotland in that regard, would you generally think it is a good idea to reinvent systems so much in the heat of the fire rather than before the fire starts?
Oh, that's a good question. I certainly think it's well known in government and the study of government that major formal reorganisations are expensive in terms of the time it takes to do, the time it takes for civil servants to become proficient in their new role, and the time it takes for people to understand what their roles are in relation to other people. So I think any government would pause before having a major formal reorganisation. So I think what I would say is the reorganisation in 2007 was the profound one. This one, I think it's more difficult to say how big it was. I think a good example is when some of the Scottish Government documents essentially say we had a directorate working on Brexit and we repurposed that directorate to deal with COVID-19. So in some senses, I think that would seem odd to people that they would do that. But it makes sense in that what that directorate was trying to do was to coordinate a response across government on a complex issue. So it made sense for people experienced in that very broad task of coordination to be involved in a directorate. So I think some things do make sense. I wouldn't want to give the impression that I think this is a lot of sort of needless moving the deck chairs around. It's just difficult to know in detail what the purpose was of each directorate because the documents focus on the formalisation of the roles.
My question, I think, was a little bit more specific than that. You go on at various stages in your report to discuss, for example, in the context of advisory structures, but also decision-making structures. this is in the context of the devolution and intergovernmental relations section of your report. You refer to the fact that there were systems for achieving medical advice from experts via, for example, SAGE
Yes.
and its various subgroups.
Yes.
And there were existing decision-making bodies, such as COBRA, for example.
Yes.
And that you question, I think, you pose the question at least, as to whether more effort could have been made to try to use those existing structures developed for the purpose of an emergency.
Yes.
And you question, therefore, by extension, as I understand it, whether the development of these new, more Scottish-based systems, I think broadly one can say, was necessarily a good idea in the circumstances.
To be honest, I'm not sure. It's difficult to tell from the evidence available. I can say in general terms, some of these things make sense. So it makes sense to have a family of directorates that try to coordinate policy across government. I think maybe it makes sense to give them names that relate to the tasks. And maybe that's the advantage of the directorate system. It's difficult. The thing that I would be less sure about would be, for example, a lot of directorate functionality comes down to the people who lead them and their experience and such like. I don't have enough detail on their experience in relevant things, or if they're put into new roles, or this was an extension of their old role. So it's difficult to tell. I think it would be difficult for anyone on the outside to tell how these things work, and presumably very difficult for the Scottish Government to explain how they work to a typical citizen.
I wonder if I could give a comparison about which we've already heard some evidence. You have, although it's not the area you've been asked to look at, you'll be aware of the fact that there was a body called Public Health Scotland that played a predominant role in the pandemic response. And it was the case that the Scottish Government, as I think you note in your report, was keen to try to develop a new and better system for dealing with Scotland's considerable health inequalities.
Yes.
And part of that plan was the development of a body to coordinate the public health response, which was Public Health Scotland.
Yes.
And it became operational in April of 2020.
Yes.
And although that had been pre-planned, that was a difficult, we've heard some evidence that was a difficult time, obviously, for that to happen. Yeah. It has been accepted on their behalf that when one creates new structures like that, it's inevitable that there will be a degree of practical and cultural and organisational change and reorganisation that will be necessary.
Yes.
And I understand it to be their position that they would accept that that was not ideal in the middle of a pandemic, but there was no choice because that had been pre-planned.
Yeah, so I know...
My ultimate goal here is not to get into that, sorry, Professor Kerr. I just wanted to draw a comparison to say, do these same concerns apply in your area of expertise with regard to organisational change within government, as I've said, in the heat of the fire?
I think they're comparable but different. I would say that the introduction of Public Health Scotland was much more like the introduction of directorates in 2007, in that had been years in the planning, and that had been a long-term attempt to coordinate health and other issues between Scottish Government public health bodies and local government. So that, in some senses, I would describe what they had done, say, from the mid-2010s onwards as good practice in long-term planning. So that is different from the reorganisation of directorates, which took place much more quickly. My impression is some of this was much more overnight, so there's a difference in terms of the work that goes in. So I think Public Health Scotland would be the example of long-term planning organisation, whereas the directorates would be this short-term crisis response.
Thank you very much. Could we go to paragraph 125, please? This is, I think, where you're expressing your opinion in relation to topic 1, which is technically the preparedness topic, although I think you quite helpfully use these opinion sections to try and tell us a bit about how this feeds into our core function here, which is to look at the actual decision making. And I think in this paragraph you say that the focus on being better prepared over time to make effective decisions based on a commitment to continuous policy learning and being increasingly better prepared for an unfolding pandemic is a strong feature of Scottish Government oral testimony for Module 1 and written testimony for Module 2A as follows. First, a general focus on the Scottish Government being a learning organisation is a key feature of the Scottish Government's Scottish approach narrative on decision making. Second, multiple witness statements describe continuous learning to respond to an emergency problem more effectively. Preparedness for future phases of Covid-19 would be improved because the Scottish Government had far more information about the nature and spread of the virus and its ability to respond. Third, this preparedness would be bolstered by new arrangements, including the establishment of a Scottish Government advisory system based on the Scottish Government's realisation that it should be less reliant on UK science advice mechanisms, and B, new specialist directorates better able to respond to the immediate Covid-19 threat than prepare properly for another. So I think there what you're helpfully doing, Professor, is you're bringing together the importance which we learned from Module 1 of being well prepared and learning lessons. And you're applying that also to the fact that we're not dealing here with a single incident that happened on one day, but something that went on for a period of years. And I think your assertion is that it is, well, the assertion in the documents, the Scottish Government's assertion is that they learned lessons as things went on, and therefore I assume, assert that they improved their response. Is that correct?
Yes. Could I expand on that?
Of course. We'd very much like you to.
So I would say that if you were to distill down all of the evidence from the Scottish Government, you could turn it into a very simple, convincing story, which is we are a well-coordinated learning organisation. We may not have been prepared for this new pandemic in spring 2020. But we are an effective organisation to the extent that we can learn and respond to subsequent pandemics much more effectively. I think that is the Scottish position, the Scottish Government position. And I think also there is witness statements from the former First Minister and Deputy First Minister that encapsulate that assertion of learning. So the First Minister says, I told the Scottish Cabinet in December 2020 that essentially we have learned that you cannot wait for this problem to become a crisis, you have to act quickly. We learned that from the first lockdown. The Deputy First Minister says, we've learned that in key cases, sometimes only a major lockdown will do. You know, these other measures are not going to work, and we need to do it. So they both talk about learning from the previous experience in the sense that it would inform their future decisions. And, you know, that is a good learning organisation. But what I can't then do is reconcile that with the fact that they appear to have made exactly the same mistakes twice. The first one was understandable because the virus was novel. Lockdown in March was something that was profoundly different from what anyone had been used to. They clearly were not sure what would happen, how much people would adhere to the guidelines, such like. But they state time and time again in their documents, we learned a lot from what happened during that lockdown, and we have learned a lot about what this virus is. And yet they appear to have produced the same delays in response for the second lockdown as the first. So in my mind, that does not exhibit pandemic preparedness in relation to continuously learning. And so I've been this is slightly speculative, but what I would like clarity on from the Scottish Government is, in a nutshell, do they think that the virus in 2020, by the end, was so different that they could not prepare for it, and therefore it's very difficult to prepare ever for a novel virus? Or is there some other explanation for the fact that they learned so much and yet acted so late?
I think you've confined your comments there to what happened during 2020, but the inquiry has heard evidence about from statisticians, the government statistician and the PHS statistician, about there being significantly high levels of cases, higher than other places in the United Kingdom, later in the pandemic, but still in the period we're interested in particular from around August 2021. We have heard that those high rates obviously went up and down, but they continued, and there continued to be a high mortality rate resulting from what were known as the Delta and Omicron variants from 2020, from that point into 2022. We have heard evidence that there were significant issues with hospitals becoming overwhelmed in 2021, which required the military to be drafted in to assist. We've heard evidence of this situation being described as a perfect storm. We've heard evidence from particular impacted organisations that their voice continued not to be heard during the pandemic, and that members of their communities continued to suffer, including oral testimony to that effect yesterday. Are these features of the evidence, and of course we keep our mind open to what the evidence may be, are these features of the evidence consistent with your, what I understand to be your general proposition, that the evidence doesn't seem to suggest that you've seen that lessons were learned during the pandemic, such as to combat further waves and further devastation?
Yes, I think that the Scottish Government documents talk much more about learning than they demonstrate learning feeding into action. I should say I made this point more strongly in the third draft of my report. I did get a response from the Scottish Government, which was essentially a list of the ways in which they were learning. And I put that list in my fourth report. But my sense is that essentially that's what it is. It's a list of activity in different parts of the Scottish Government. It is not a coherent narrative of how they learn effectively during a crisis. And I think that's one of the sort of unresolved issues here about the extent to which there's a rhetoric of learning that does not match reality. And I suppose the other thing I should note is, in my mind, the Scottish Government, much like the UK Government, have described inquiries as the place to learn. In fact, when the now Deputy First Minister gave evidence to the committee I was in, inquiry that I was involved in, effective government decision making, I believe she said that we will learn lessons during the inquiries. And that struck me as quite odd, given that the focus so much on these documents is about continuous learning. Now, maybe they're talking about two different kinds. Maybe there's a difference between trial and error learning on a daily basis. And there is evidence of that. For example, when the former Health Secretary talks about learning how to deal with PPE problems. Maybe that's what they mean. But I don't see evidence of this longer-term learning that will then produce something that will inform the next pandemic. I think, if there was one of the committees they have talks about disease X. This disease, we don't know anything about it, but we know it's coming. I don't see anything from Scottish Government documents that says this is what we have learned that will inform how we deal with disease X.
So are you saying it's translating the words into actions?
Yes, I think I'll be careful how I say this, but the Scottish Government produces beautiful strategy documents. It has a wonderful language to describe how it wants to be. It does not have the same effective language for describing how it is.
Lady, if that's a convenient...
It is, certainly. Thank you. I shall return at 11:30.
All right.
Mr Dawson.
Thank you, my lady. Professor Kearney, I'd just like to move on to a slightly different, though connected area, which is the Scottish Government's commitment to human rights and equality, which is something we're interested in this module. If we could have page 5 of the report up, paragraph 1 again. You say around in the 5th paragraph there that the aspirational model, this is of the Scottish approach involves establishing a national performance framework, NPF, with a core purpose, replacing sectoral government departments with cross-sectoral directorates, co-producing public sector commitments to deliver the NPF, and focusing on long-term aims such as to reduce inequalities rather than short-term targets based on a fixation with national elections. So the commitment to the reduction of inequalities is something that is part of this aspirational principles to be applied to the way that decisions are made.
Yes.
And in paragraph 14, you refer to, from 2015, the Scottish Government used its revision of the NPF 10-year plan, amongst other things, at bullet point 2, identify priorities in relation to addressing poverty and reducing inequalities. Then First Minister Nicola Sturgeon made strong commitments to reduce education and health inequalities.
Yes.
And could we look at paragraph 113, please? Again, this is in the section where you were looking at some of the evidence that was available in relation to Scottish Government from Module 1. And in that paragraph, as part of your analysis of the context of the pandemic, you say that health outcomes do not reflect the successful application of these new policies, citing amongst other materials the Bamborough and Marmot report commissioned by this inquiry. Is that right?
Yes.
And could we look at paragraph 115, please? And do you say in this paragraph that in the field of health inequalities, you state this is an example of where there were aspirations not put into practice?
Yes.
And again, I think it's fair to say that commitments to inequalities, including health inequalities and human rights in a more general sense, feature aspirationally, if you like, in some of the key structural documents, including the Four Harms approach.
Yes, and so other scholars know much more about human rights approaches than I, but my impression is the reference to a human rights approach is now the Scottish Government's thing. It's, I mean, I don't mean that in a negative sense. It is very committed to adopting that kind of language throughout government. And I think my impression is it's the same kind of aspiration. It's a very general term that's very difficult to, very difficult to oppose. Who wouldn't want a human rights approach? But the detail of how they make sense of it and the choices they make, I think that's the thing that is less visible.
So when you say the choices they make, ultimately what that means is whether the decisions that they make actually put that aspiration into practice. Yes,
and how they define human rights and whose human rights and the balance between human rights and, I mean, so lockdown was really about removing human rights. So if they were to talk about a human rights approach to something like that, it'd be very difficult to make sense of without more detail.
And your report as regards the period before the pandemic, drawing, as I say, amongst other things on the Bamborough and Marmot report, but other sources, suggests that although this approach to inequalities, in particular health inequalities, had been an aspirational part of Scottish Government decision-making for some time, updated and reinforced in 2015, as we saw, that health inequalities and inequalities in general remained a significant problem with Scottish society at the time the pandemic started. Is that correct?
Yes.
And this inquiry has heard significant evidence relating to this module that those inequalities and health inequalities were exacerbated by the way the pandemic was managed. Would it surprise you to hear that it has heard that evidence?
No, I think that the experience of COVID-19 policy symbolises a lot of the problems of inequalities that we saw before 2020.
Thank you. I'd like to move now on to a different area which you've also very helpfully covered in some detail in your report, It's an area, the area is devolution and the interplay between the UK government and the Scottish government. We have heard in the inquiry a substantial body of evidence, generally speaking, about the devolution settlements across the UK, not least in the expert opinion from Professor Ailsa Henderson, which I know that you have been able to look at.
Yes.
And so it may be that the ground that we cover here can be a bit more focused because we have some general context. But I'd like to ask you some questions about that. I think you say in your report that because of the devolution settlement, which attributes certain policy areas to the Scottish Government, but reserves certain other policy areas to the UK Government, that both the UK Government and the Scottish Government share overall responsibility for policy decisions that impact Scotland.
Yes.
And you say in your report at paragraph 56, if we go to that, that in this context, I think you used the word blurry to describe the boundary between UK and Scottish Government responsibilities. I think at this stage you're referring to the period before the pandemic. There was blurriness about the lines of responsibility. Broadly speaking, is that right?
I would say there's always a blurry boundary in this kind of system.
Yes. And would it be fair to say that when a disaster comes along, like the pandemic, which affects all areas of society and life, and therefore all policy areas, that this blurriness starts to become a bit of a problem?
Yes.
Because in response to a pandemic, one needs clarity, not blurriness.
Yes.
Clarity as to whose responsibility each element of society it is.
Yes.
And were there, well, the inquiry has heard evidence that there were systems in place, I think as far back as the Scotland Act, but certainly from more recent years, including a Memorandum of Understanding and supplementary agreements last updated in 2013, that were designed, amongst other things, to encourage activity within, amongst other bodies, a joint ministerial committee to try to deal with this very issue of what you've described as the blurriness.
Yeah.
That'd be fair?
Yes.
And it is Professor Henderson's evidence that there had been relatively little activity in that regard in the years preceding the pandemic. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
And that, in fact, the Joint Ministerial Committee had met only 11 times in relation to Scotland between 2007 and 2019.
Yes.
And it hadn't met after 2019 and before the pandemic, so during 2019.
Yes.
And in 2007, the 2007 date is the time that the SNP became the controlling party of the Scottish Government.
Yes.
And do you think that it is the case that our constitutional settlement required that there ought to be fora in which these boundaries should have been rendered less blurry, such as to make a pandemic response involving both policy-making agencies more effective?
Yes.
Another aspect which you touch upon in this regard in your report is the suggestion that the existence of these blurry lines may also make it easier for decision makers in the Scottish Government to attribute blame for bad policy outcomes to the UK Government and vice versa, thereby potentially creating an accountability deficit in Scotland.
Yes.
Could you explain a little bit more about what you mean by that concept?
Well, so this would take us back to the topic that we began with about, new Scottish politics or old Westminster. I think a characteristic of a Westminster system is high stakes accountability for problems. It is parties contest elections based on who should take the credit, who should take the blame for decisions. And that is reflected in relationships between UK and devolved governments, particularly when they're of a different party. So I would say the way that the parties narrate the relationships relates profoundly strongly to the way that they campaign. So I would say that on both sides, the UK government leadership and the SNP government, to criticise each other in key cases is a key part of the way in which they present themselves to the electorate.
To turn then to the outcomes of this as far as the pandemic was concerned, you explain very helpfully in your report, which hopefully I can summarise, but please correct me if I'm going wrong, that there would, in these circumstances, have been two ways in which, from a legal and constitutional perspective, the pandemic could have been managed. I think you highlight, about which evidence has been heard in Module 2 as well, that the pandemic could have been governed by the Civil Contingencies Act route, or it could have been governed the way it was via what I think you describe as the public health route.
Yes.
And that these two routes have different legal and constitutional outcomes in terms of responsibility for the management of the pandemic. Is that right?
I think so.
Yes. And I think that the evidence we've heard in Module 2 already, and please tell me if you disagree with this, is that had the Civil Contingencies Act route been used, that would have resulted in a greater degree of responsibility being vested in the UK government for matters pertaining to Scotland than actually happened. Is that correct?
That is what I'm relying on more expert people than I.
Yes, but that's
my understanding.
Yes, I understand. You're not a legal expert, Professor Keir. It's very important to point that out. But in your report, you have summarised evidence available from other sources, which leads you to believe that that is the case. And certainly my understanding is that's consistent with the evidence the inquiry has already heard in that regard. In the end of the day, what happened was there was the Coronavirus Act 2020, which, amongst its schedules, accorded certain powers to the Scottish Government to do things like impose legal restrictions on members of Scottish society. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
That gave, that operated within the devolution arrangements subject to any extra powers that were included in the 2020 Act?
Yes.
And would it be fair to say at an overall level, without getting into any legal detail, that that resulted in a situation whereby the blurry lines became something of an issue because the pandemic strategy in Scotland required input in certain areas from the UK government, but accorded overall control to the Scottish government?
Yes.
For example, you highlight in your report at least one major area, but possibly other areas that would technically fall within the reserved powers of the UK government. The major one is funding,
Yes.
to which we will return. The UK Treasury remains a reserved matter. And there are perhaps multiple matters, but another one which is of some significance to this module is the question of borders.
Yes.
Because border control generally is a reserved matter.
Yes.
Therefore, is it fair to say that your assessment is that they're required, given that that route was selected, to be a significant degree of coordination and cooperation between the governments, given the all-encompassing nature of the pandemic and its effects?
Very much so.
And given that requirement, the blurry lines caused a significant problem.
I think so, yes.
You also, in your report, in the very helpful, lengthy section about pandemic preparedness, talk about a lot of systems which existed and about which the inquiry has heard in detail in Module 1 to do with resilience partnerships and that sort of thing. Given that, is it your understanding that the systems which existed pre-pandemic, as far as Scotland's preparedness was concerned, were based on a civil contingencies type outcome in terms of the way a pandemic or any other emergency might be managed?
My impression is that they had two different systems running on parallel tracks. So one of them was civil contingencies and the legislation that required the Scottish Government to prepare for an emergency.
Yes, but the systems that we were talking about were systems that would be employed in a civil contingencies type scenario, the scenario that wasn't actually followed through. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, my impression, to be honest, I found the documents very confusing. But my impression was they were anticipating either emergencies defined very generally, so they very rarely refer to a pandemic, or they're anticipating, my impression is that they're anticipating emergencies a bit like natural disasters, where this is really quick responses by emergency services to an incident. I don't think that many of the documents talk about, you know, the scale of this kind of pandemic.
Could I ask you, could we look at, please, paragraph 59? Under subparagraph E, please. You talk there, I think, and tell us that the materials which you've looked at suggest that, in written testimony in particular, that from a legal perspective, and with the caveat that you're not a lawyer and you're relying on this material, the Scottish Government's position, or at least certain individuals who are prominent in the Scottish Government at the time, suggest that the Scottish Government could have could have acted so as to impose lockdown, for example, before the Coronavirus Act 2020.
Yes, and this is one of an example where I think I got far more clarity from the Scottish Government in comparison to other issues, because in the draft of my report, I had said I'm honestly not sure if the Scottish Parliament could have legislated in this field, and I'm not sure what the legal position was before that. And I got very clear, which I quoted here, very clear feedback from the Scottish Government that the Scottish Government could have initiated the legislation in the Scottish Parliament because this was clearly a public health responsibility, so there were no issues of being challenged, but that it made a decision not to legislate in the Scottish Parliament in favour of a four nations approach built on legislation in Westminster.
Right. So your understanding from the Scottish Government materials is that the Scottish Government had the power to impose a lockdown before it was imposed?
If it legislated to do so.
Yes.
Yes.
Indeed. But that it chose not to in favour of the four nations approach, which culminated in a coordinated commencement to the lockdown in March 2020.
Yes.
Is it fair to say, one might say, I think, that, or is it fair to say that in this area there may be a significant degree of confusion as to where the power lies in this regard?
Yes.
And that perhaps is why you have struggled, as others have, to work out what the position is.
Yes.
But your understanding of the evidence is that the Scottish Government's position is that it felt it could legislate for a lockdown in the period before the 23rd of March.
Yes.
And we know, of course, that the Scottish Government did not legislate and have a lockdown for that period, but it did issue a number of recommended courses of action in early March to curb social interaction and the like.
Yes.
Given that there is a lack of clarity in this area, it would appear, and it is your evidence that that is the case, is this the sort of thing that would have benefited from clarification of the blurry lines, perhaps in a joint ministerial committee, so that if an emergency like this struck, everyone would know what their powers were?
Yes.
Does it appear to be the case that the lack of clarity contributed to issues around a delay in the lockdown at that time, based on your assessment of the materials?
that's tricky for me to answer. What I can say for sure is that the feedback from the Scottish Government is that they thought this was the quickest way to do it. So I think from their perspective, this reduced delay. I think the counterfactual is, what if Scottish Government ministers had much earlier on recognised this as a problem, thought that the UK Government was not doing enough about it, and therefore legislated much more quickly. From the documents they've given, they do not give the impression that they were operating on a much more accelerated timetable than the UK Government, and therefore they were quite close together. It made sense for them to do this quickly. I think that sometimes things that aren't left said is that although the UK Government does not challenge Scottish Government legislation much, the UK Government and citizens can challenge Scottish Parliament legislation if deemed out of competence. So I think it would be reasonable for the Scottish Government to say that during a crisis, when there is not 100% clarity on who's responsible, it makes sense for Westminster to legislate, because then it won't receive that challenge over competence in a way that the Scottish Government could.
But as I think you accepted earlier, one might, in a counterfactual situation, had there been greater clarification over these matters between the governments to deal with the pandemic,
Yes.
we might have been operating in a counterfactual situation where there wasn't that lack of clarity.
Yes, I think if they had their time again, they would have clarified this, and the Scottish Parliament would have legislated.
Okay. One of the other things that you mentioned there that we'll come on to in a moment is you interpret the evidence that you've seen as being that the Scottish Government had the formal responsibility but not the financial means to act, before saying this is an example of the blurry boundaries. What is your understanding of the concern about the financial means that would have been necessary for the Scottish Government to act? Okay,
So this is a remarkably concise answer based on the detail. Essentially, the history of Scottish Government finance has been that the Treasury essentially provides the budget, the size. The Scottish Government decides how to spend it. So,
Professor, could I just say, I want to get into a little bit of the detail of how funding works in a moment. Sorry to cut across you, but I'm just trying to clarify what your understanding of the evidence that emanates from the Scottish Government as to what it was specifically about the financial issue that meant that they had the responsibility but not the financial means to act, which it seems played some part in the decision making. We'll get on to the more difficult stuff in a moment, actually.
Okay, so I think the Scottish Government position is that an act such as lockdown would be profoundly expensive, and that has been borne out. And it did not have the means to borrow the money to finance that activity. It had a budget, but that budget was already allocated, and we're talking about a scale that it wouldn't be able to fund. For example, I think the biggest example was the employment furlough. It didn't feel able financially to fund its own furlough.
So, to be fair, I think it's important to point out that the evidence that you've seen is pointing out that that was an important factor in the decision-making as well. It wasn't simply a matter of we can just go off and have a lockdown because we can. There were other considerations, including these financial considerations, to take into account.
Yes, because I think the key question when they're considering solutions is the solution feasible? And so at the time they were wrestling with two feasibility issues. One was the political one, will people accept the lockdown? The other was the technical feasibility. Can we do it and can we afford it? And I think, that informed all decision-making at that time.
Thank you. Before we move on to look at this area of funding in a bit more detail, I just wanted to clarify with you, which is an important, although I think sometimes perhaps misunderstood element of the way that the devolution settlement played out in the pandemic. It is important to understand, is it not, that the UK government continued to have a direct role in controlling Scottish matters during the course of the pandemic.
Yes.
Not all Scottish matters, but certain Scottish matters that were reserved to their competence.
Yes.
So, for example, as we'll see in a moment, the funding arrangements were still generally controlled by the Treasury.
Yes.
I say generally because there are some tax-raising powers of the Scottish Government that we'll touch on.
Yes.
Other areas, for example, that we've heard something about already, defence is a reserve matter.
Yes.
So that during the course of the pandemic, when the military required to be brought in to assist with hospitals, that was a matter over which the Secretary of State for Scotland took control.
Yes.
Yes, you may, if you don't know that particular, in general terms, defence matters would be for the UK government. And if you take it from me on the hypothesis that they're required to be defence intervention, you would expect that to be a matter for the UK government.
Yes.
Okay. So although operational control of the pandemic lay with the Scottish government, the UK government had exclusive control in certain areas and therefore an important part to play in Scotland's pandemic response.
Yes.
Thank you. So then to turn to the question of funding, we go to paragraph 255, please. This is what we described earlier as topic 7. You were asked a specific question about this, and you say, I think, at paragraph 258, if we could just go over the page. I think, as you've already said in passing, that the general rule, as far as funding in Scotland is concerned, is that the Treasury heavily influences the size of the Scottish Government's budget, but it does not control how the Scottish Government spends its budget.
Yes.
Is that correct? Again, if I could try and put this to you, and if you disagree, please tell me. My understanding of the very helpful evidence you've given in this regard is that funding is normally allocated to Scotland by the UK Treasury as part of a block grant. Is that
yes.
correct? And that when the grant is being fixed by the UK Treasury, there will be some level of negotiation with the Scottish Government about how big that should be.
Yes.
And broadly speaking, the way that the amount is arrived at is by the application of something called the Barnett formula. Is that
yes.
correct? And the Barnett formula is an agreed, though not uncontroversial, means by which a budget is set effectively for England, and Scotland is given a percentage of that, and that's its block grant. Is that correct?
Yes. The only way I'll qualify it is that the term Barnett formula has taken on this wider meaning. It means all sorts of things to different people. So it can be defined in the way you suggest, but I would not assume that that is a widely understood description of how it works.
Right. Effectively, the way I've suggested is that it involves the application of a fixed percentage of the amount allocated to the budget for England, and the application of that to the English budget gives you what the Scottish budget is. Is that broadly correct?
Yes, and I think the brief context is that it was treated by the Treasury as a means to make changes to the Scottish budget as automatic as possible.
Yes.
They didn't want to have these annual disputes about how much the budget should be,
yes.
so there's a formula to avoid
yes,
that.
Yes, indeed. So that's why, although one might do it a different way, many people may, there is a fixed formula which tries to simplify the process.
Yes.
And that presumably gives a certain degree of predictability about what the funding might be for future planning purposes and many other factors.
Yes.
At paragraph 261, this is in the section where you are talking about the Scottish Government's pandemic response. You note that the Scottish Government's budget available to deal with the pandemic was largely influenced by spending on comparable services in England. Is that because where large amounts of effectively emergency funding were allocated for England by the UK Treasury, generally speaking, the amount for Scotland was calculated by the application of the Barnett formula?
Yes, particularly if the expectation would be a lot of the funding would be on the National Health Service. So that would be treated as a devolved matter, highly comparable, so it would be relatively straightforward to apply it there.
In circumstances where the Barnett formula is applied as the tool you described it as being to a block grant, it may well be the case that Scottish Government may apply a greater proportion to one area and a smaller proportion to another. Is that right?
Yes.
And the Scottish Government has the power to decide, once it's got its grant, what it uses it for.
Yes.
And over a block grant which applies to all services, although the Scottish Government may disagree, the amounts that are required may balance out, because there might be greater spending in one area as a result of Scottish Government policy, but there may be a lesser requirement to spend in another area. Is that right?
Well, certainly they have to balance their budget. Yes. So any additional spending on one area has to be met by a reduction somewhere else.
Yes. But the theory, at least, is that they require to do that, and therefore, if the Scottish Government decides to spend more on health, for example, it would have to find that proportionate deficit elsewhere.
Yes.
And is it correct to say, as I think we've confirmed already, that the way in which funding for the Covid-19 pandemic generally worked would be that money would be allocated by the UK Treasury as an emergency budget, and that the Barnett formula would be applied in order to reach the amount that Scotland would get?
Yeah, so I think eventually, instead of working it out after the spending had taken place, they estimated what the spending would be.
In advance?
Yeah.
Yes. Is it your view that such an approach to working out the Scottish share for specific matters in an emergency situation, which, although generally certainly adopted, if not necessarily entirely agreed with, is the approach to overall block grant, is an appropriate way of allocating funding to Scotland for its specific needs in a specific emergency?
No, I would say that what became known as the Barnett formula, as me being academic, was a political solution. It was not a coherent financial solution.
And again, given your evidence that this was not an appropriate thing to deal with this sort of situation, is this the sort of matter which could have formed part of discussions in a joint ministerial committee to work out how such eventualities may be dealt with in an emergency?
Yes, I would say, given the level of crisis and the sort of unprecedented nature of the crisis, the kind of negotiations between civil servants in the UK and Scottish Government would require a level of cooperation between ministers to give them the cover to talk those things through.
I think you have drawn upon perhaps other sources, but certainly John Swinney's evidence to Module 1, where he said that not just at ministerial level, but more broadly, his evidence was that relations between the two governments at the time the pandemic struck were particularly poor.
Yes, I think, and it might be important to stress, poorer than what. So I would say from 1999 to 2007, you had Labour leading both governments, and all of these issues you talk about would be dealt with quite informally. If there were crises at a ministerial level, it would be dealt with informally between parties. From 2007, that was not possible, and the devolved administrations pushed for more formal arrangements. But I think these meetings are largely in the control of the UK government. The devolved governments can't successfully demand that they happen. So there's sort of subordinate partners there. So their relationship was already bad. Over the years, it's been both sides. So the SP has been highly dissatisfied with the UK government. The UK government has portrayed the SNP government as not to be trusted. So this was a key feature before, that their position was it was very difficult to share information with the Scottish government because we do not trust their ministers to keep it quiet. So there was a lack of trust between ministers. It was exacerbated, I think, by key personalities and exacerbated by the Brexit, which was famously rejected by most people in Scotland.
Yeah.
So I would say up to roughly the point of Brexit, it's hard to imagine a worse relationship between the UK and devolved government.
Well, thank you very much for that context. We'll obviously explore these matters with appropriate witnesses in due course, my lady. Just a few final things on funding. One of the points that you mentioned earlier was that there was concern, and there's documentary evidence to suggest that this was the case during the course of the pandemic, that Scotland's policy control over the management of the pandemic may be limited by its lack of access to financial levers. In particular, you gave the most prominent example of their ability to fund the furlough scheme were they to exercise their power to impose a further lockdown, for example, at the time of, at a different time perhaps from England. You, in your report, talk about this issue. It was, I think, a part of the narrative from the Scottish Government during the course of the pandemic that this was a problem. And you, I think, in your report comment on this, where you talk about the extent to which financial levers may influence policy decisions in Scotland.
Yes.
And is that your understanding of the Scottish Government's position broadly from the papers that you've looked at?
Yes, that they needed the UK Government to allocate additional funds, that the Scottish Government did not have the means to provide those funds themselves because, you know, almost all of this additional funding came from borrowing and the Scottish Government does not have those powers. It needed the certainty of how much it would receive so that it could allocate that funding quickly. And I think its position is it not only relied on the UK Government to give it this funding, but it also did not get a clear enough steer about what that funding would be.
That's its position. There is evidence, which the inquiry has before it, that this was a matter of some concern to the Scottish Government in around November 2020. You'll remember at that time that contemplation was being given to the possibility of what were called firebreak lockdowns to break chains of transmission. And there were concerns expressed not only on the part of the Scottish Government, but indeed other politicians in Scotland that to do so would perhaps run the risk of a measure being taken that could not be supported financially. Is it your understanding that a clarification was made at that stage to the effect that, by the then Prime Minister, that the furlough scheme would be available for future lockdowns in Scotland?
I think from that document, I took that the former Prime Minister had given a verbal assurance that that would be true. Yes,
there was something of a political issue. The document you're talking about is, there are two news articles, just for the record, I'll read their numbers, INQ 000360049, and the one relating to the Prime Ministerial response is INQ 000360145. Because would it not seem, from a political perspective, odd if the position were that, in terms of the Coronavirus Act, the political power had been accorded to the Scottish Government to do just that, create a lockdown if they felt it appropriate in the interest of Scotland. For the government, the UK Government, then to say, well, if you feel you need to do that at a different time from us, we won't fund it. Would that not be politically unusual situation to be in?
I think so. I think the context you describe is important here, because if you had a situation before 2020 when the two governments were working really well together, they knew each other and trusted each other, then if the Prime Minister had said, we will provide this funding in a flexible manner, the Scottish Government would have been assured and would have acted accordingly. I think the problem here is that, in fact, I'm sure this will come up in their testimony, Scottish Government ministers do not trust UK Government ministers and would not take a verbal assurance as something that they could plan on. And I think it's that lack of trust, communication, cooperation that would undermine the delivery of that kind of flexibility.
Okay. Could I just ask you one further thing on this? Oh, sorry, before I move on from that, just to point out, of course, the other devolved nations did have firebreak lockdowns around that time. And as I understand it, the Welsh firebreak lockdown had started before those exchanges on the 1st of November. And it may be subject to subsequent evidence, but obviously those devolved nations have similar financial arrangements.
Yes.
And therefore it would seem that some sort of plan had been laid out for the Welsh firebreak lockdown, which no doubt we will address in due course.
Yes, and I should say there's a long history of that kind of allocation. I think, not everyone would use this term, but the academic, you would say that is called formula bypass. So the UK government would ostensibly use the Barnett formula to make these decisions, but it would always reserve the right to make any ad hoc financial decision it wanted to in relation to devolved governments. So there is a long history of them essentially saying, here's your budget, but then on an ad hoc basis giving different allocations.
Okay, thank you. One matter that I just wanted to raise here, paragraph 289, please. This is in your conclusion section relating to topic 7. You earlier on have done an analysis of some reports and materials available from, amongst others, Audit Scotland, relating to the question of how the money was spent. And yes. What was the conclusion which came from that analysis, that it's difficult to know exactly what the money was actually spent on?
Yes, I think Audit Scotland's quite clear on that they're very dissatisfied with the lack of clarity on how the money was spent.
When we talk about the money that was allocated in support of the pandemic response.
Yes, and I think the added complication is that Audit Scotland can only audit resource allocation by the Scottish Government and the Scottish public sector. And, this response was characterised by spending from the UK to the Scottish Government or the UK directly. And so not only did it not know what Scottish Government spending was in sufficient detail, it was unable to audit UK Government spending.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to move on to a separate topic, please, which is to do with the structures for decision-making within the Scottish Government. In particular, paragraph 42 of your report, please. And you say that the Scottish Cabinet performs equivalent functions to the UK Cabinet. And I think you say there that in the constitutional or the decision-making structures of the Scottish Government, similar to the UK Government, the Cabinet is the ultimate decision-maker. Is that correct?
Yes.
And at paragraph 45, you note that compared to the UK Cabinet, the Scottish Cabinet is smaller, which creates a greater potential to perform a more meaningful collective function. Is that right?
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
My impression of the UK Cabinet is that in fact, you can see it visually. It's people sitting around a huge table, and there are far more people there than could possibly contribute collectively to joint decision-making. I don't think that's what it exists for. And if ministers want to perform that kind of work, they do that in far smaller cabinet committees or subcommittees. So I think for as long as I've studied UK politics, cabinet has not been seen as a decision-making body. It's rather been seen as a decision-ratifying body.
Right.
Whereas at least the Scottish Government description of its cabinet is that because it's smaller, because they have cross-cutting responsibilities, because directorates can respond to different ministers, and because the Deputy First Minister has this overarching role, it can perform that function that would be that most people would think cabinets perform.
But consistently with some other themes from your evidence, you say in paragraph 45 that this potential is not necessarily or always realised.
Yeah, it's difficult. I would say the story that we make all decisions through the Scottish Cabinet, I think, is the official story. It was if I was doing academic work, it would be my starting point for critical analysis to look at what actually happened. I would just assume that there was always this gap between the official picture and how things are really done.
When you mentioned earlier the concept of the UK Cabinet you were describing as potentially a decision-ratifying body, What exactly do you mean by that? Does that mean the decisions are taken elsewhere and simply put before the Cabinet to rubber stamp them? Is that roughly what you're saying?
I mean, rubber stamping has a real
Well,
weight.
please use your own words to describe what that is.
I would say that given the amount of time and deliberation and knowledge that it would take to make a meaningful collective decision, and the time given to a UK Cabinet and the amount of time for deliberation, those two things don't match up. You could not make decisions in that manner, and they don't. I don't think even the UK Cabinet puts up much of a pretense that that's how it works.
The theory, however, of Cabinet being the decision-making body is, I think, that various different aspects of government decision-making and, by extension, Scottish life or UK life are represented by different people, such that different views can be brought to bear in a decision-making body that then leads to a collective decision. Is that the theory, at least?
Yes, and I think those discussions do happen. Ministers, civil servants and others do debate those issues. But I think the UK style, if you like, is to do those things before Cabinet and behind closed doors, and then use Cabinet as a way of ratifying the decisions and discussions already had.
Yes.
The portrayal of the Scottish Cabinet here is different, at least from the Scottish Government. It is that the Scottish Cabinet is the place where people have these debates and make these choices.
Okay. And you mentioned there the complexity and volume of material that was inconsistent with the idea that UK Cabinet was actually making the decisions. I mean, obviously, within the pandemic, as we've seen, the volume and complexity of the material was at the extreme end.
Yeah.
And do you think, therefore, that proper Cabinet decision-making, as the Scottish Government purports happens within its decision-making structures, would have the advantage of spreading the burden of that information and allowing its totality and complexity to be taken more into account in an ultimate decision than, say, for example, if you had just an individual decision-maker?
Yes, I think it performed a profoundly important function because, on the one hand, the minute by minute, day-to-day decisions of ministers could not be could not all be processed by a Cabinet, but they were able to process key matters of principle that would guide all activity. So
your evidence there is on the assumption, I think, to be clear, that the purported model is the model that actually played out.
yes.
But we will explore that in the evidence. But your position is that during the course of the pandemic, that purported model of Cabinet decision-making would have been a good one for the reasons that we've discussed.
Yes, if working well and as described, it would be an excellent way to make decisions.
The UK Parliament and with the UK Cabinet, what happened during COVID was we ended up with the Cabinet committees, like COVID-O and COVID-Os.
Yes.
They were Cabinet committees. They were comprised of people, so it wasn't as if they were just a couple of people in a corridor making a decision on their own.
Indeed not, no. But I think that would be, I think the Scottish Cabinet could be considered to be the equivalent of that Cabinet committee in terms of the size and scale. I think they had a Cabinet committee, so they thought, let's have the most important people in the room, let's make it a manageable process, particularly during emergency. And I think the idea here is that because the Scottish Cabinet is already smaller, they could do that without relying as much on Cabinet committees.
Yeah. Could I just go to paragraph 43, one final matter on this? In this paragraph, you're talking about decisions which would normally be taken at the Cabinet level. Is there clear guidance about decisions requiring to be discussed and made at Cabinet level and circumstances in which they can be delegated, for example, to an individual minister? I think here you suggest perhaps not.
I think, well, the language matters here. I think I think from their perspective, they're as clear as they need to be, because I think the thing that is either stated elsewhere or as implicit throughout is that ministers have to make judgments to interpret these rules. And individual ministers are responsible for their own behaviour. Cabinet is responsible for their collective behaviour. So this is very much about the judgment of individuals within a broad context.
So does that mean where responsibility is delegated, the Cabinet needs to decide, understand it's giving away its collective responsibility to a particular individual, which it may theoretically have some adverse consequences, because that's the reason why Cabinet exists, to have a collective view.
Yes, and it's interesting to me, the witness statements do provide examples of how this works, and I think they have provided the least controversial. I think if you look at the example they give, you think, okay, that's reasonable. So the example they give is, in principle, we will agree to remove the obligation to wear a face mask once these conditions are met. And then that's delegated to the First Minister. So I think that's, if you think these are the examples, then it's straightforward, because the principle has been established, the measures of change have been established, so this is just a case of making a decision. Yeah. I don't have access to like a full allocation of choices made by the First Minister.
Yes, I'm really trying to address this for the purpose of looking at those sorts of decisions in the abstract with you, to try and work out what would be the advantages and disadvantages, which I think we've covered.
Yeah.
I'd just like to go to paragraph 48, please. In this section, you're telling us something about the way in which the civil service works in Scotland. The civil service is a reserved matter, is that correct?
Yes.
And is it correct to say that the civil service at the time of devolution was an important part of the devolution settlement, in that in reserving the civil service to the UK government's ambit, that was one of the mechanisms by which the primacy of the Westminster Parliament would be thought to be maintained? Is that broadly correct?
Certainly. The way I describe it is, this is the way to solve most of those problems of intergovernmental relations we talked about. That regardless of the relationships between ministers, there would always be this excellent relationship between civil servants.
Right. But in terms of the constitutional settlement, one of the important things that the civil servants do is to advise ministers. That's probably their function.
Yes.
And sometimes that might involve telling a minister that they're not doing the right thing, or making a bad decision, or they should think about it, or something like that.
Yes.
And one of the things in the settlement, the devolution settlement, which related to that, was the possibility that civil servants might sometimes have to tell Scottish Government ministers that what they were wishing to do exceeded their legislative competence.
Yes.
And that was a means by which that was meant to be regulated.
Yes.
And you mentioned there the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010. Was that an act which did a number of things, but one of the things that it did was it changed the ability, the power, it accorded power to the Scottish Government to be able to appoint its own civil servants?
Yes, I mean, I will admit to being confused by the fine details of this, but my impression has always been that the Scottish Government has delegated responsibility for recruitment. So it essentially operates as to some extent autonomous organisation recruiting civil servants according to these rules. And so it's a kind of operational role within these rules. So I think the only time this becomes a problem or a contentious issue is the appointment of the most senior civil servants. And so essentially these are supposed to be non-partisan, non-political roles, but I think the most senior civil servant is performing a very delicate political task, that would have to be managed well.
But to be clear, from 2010, as you set out there is a Scottish Government Civil Service Code, is that right?
Yes.
And the fundamental rule of that is, as a civil servant, you're accountable to Scottish ministers, who are in turn accountable to the Scottish Parliament.
Yes.
There's an accountability there to the Scottish ministers as opposed to the UK government in some way.
Yes, and that did become an issue in relation to Scottish independence, because the Permanent Secretary at one time was expressing that language to say, I am here to support an SNP-led Scottish government. Mm-hmm. It is their commitment to foster independence, therefore it is my duty to foster that. So I think that was really symbolised there in terms of the balance they struck. Very much the way they articulated their role was in relation to the Scottish government, and they would often downplay their wider UK role.
Have these sorts of things given rise generally to concerns, at least about whether the Scottish civil service is too committed to the cause of independence?
I mean, there would be lots of expressed concerns by certain people. And it's hard to, so it's hard for me to give, like a balanced account of that. That's essentially an extension.
All I'm asking is that a matter which is an issue in public discourse about, but there are concerns in that regard. I'm not asking you to say whether they are well-founded or not, but merely that this is a matter on which political commentators, political experts like yourself, that you're aware that this is an issue which you sometimes are called upon to discuss and think about.
Yeah, certainly it would not be difficult to find critics of the Scottish Government civil service saying that they were too committed to the SNP government.
Thank you. Could I go to paragraph 206, please? This is the last topic that I intend to take you to, Professor. This is the section which, if I recall, is topic 5, where you're talking about public communications.
Okay.
And you give, again, a very useful commentary on this. Paragraph 206, you refer to other literature which notes that at times of crisis, leaders can be led into a more presidential style of decision-making and communication where the elected leaders seek to personalise their power. Do you think that the presidential style of leadership was a feature of the Scottish Government's communication strategy, in particular Nicola Sturgeon fronting much of the communication operation?
Yes.
And in your report, you also note at paragraph 229 that there is, you've helpfully told us about some polling which exists, which tends to suggest that Nicola Sturgeon, in her public role, certainly compared favourably to Boris Johnson in terms of public approval. But you make a distinction there between public satisfaction with government communication and the ability of the public to understand the information conveyed by governments. Could you just explain briefly the difference and the significance of that?
Yeah, so governments commission essentially proxy information of how well their campaigns are going. One of them is a question about, do you trust this government and this government to act in your best interests or something like that? Mm-hmm. So the Scottish Government scored consistently higher in terms of that general trust that this government was acting in your best interests. Mm-hmm. So I think that's not only work commissioned by the Scottish Government, but also in independent polling. I think you might struggle to find someone who didn't just come up with that same kind of picture. Right. They also commission work to try and understand, because the issue with trust is it is not all a good thing. So in work that I have reviewed, the authors prefer this idea of watchful trust, which is you put enough trust in people that you think they're competent and sincere, but you always keep an eye on them as part of your duty. And so if you simply unconditionally trust a government, you're failing in your duty to hold them to account. So I think the satisfaction and trust is quite a weak proxy of how well things are going, because people may put their trust in governments without any evidence to give them the reason to do it. Or there are clear differences in terms of trust in governments according to the extent to which you share their beliefs or you support the party that they're from. Okay, so you separate that out. There's still this difference in trust, but they are also looking for measures of understanding and compliance with the measures that they take and measures over time. So they want to know, do people understand what we're asking of them? Do they agree with what we're asking them to do, or at least are they willing to do it, and are they doing it? So those are very different polling data. One is very general, one is specific on behaviour.
And I think you say that at least there's limited evidence of the second type, the ability of the public to understand the information, whereas there is a proliferation of evidence from in various different places for public satisfaction, which may be a less reliable and less helpful indicator. Is that correct?
I think if you truly want to understand, if people understand information, you have to ask them to describe it. You have to say to them, tell me what this means. You don't ask them, do you understand what this means? Because lots of people will say they understand but will not be able to describe it. So they're working on these proxies, and there are some examples. So I think this is an interesting one that I would probe. Scottish Government representatives have been asked about this already in Scottish Parliament committees. And a committee has put to key people that there are campaigns that you've done that people clearly don't understand or even remember. So the famous one is facts, which I could perform not knowing what the 5 things stand for, but I simply could not, I don't know what they stand for. And I studied it, and in my report, they're listed. I think it's striking that a minister giving evidence to a Parliament committee was given a round of applause for recounting those 5. And I think, to me, that summed up the issue. So I think the response from key people has been, well, even if people cannot tell you what facts means, it has raised awareness, and they kind of know what it means. They know, okay, wear a face mask, distance yourself, seek a test, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of that focus from Scottish Government submissions on this is generally going okay. Look at the weight of communication we're doing. And in fact, I would say that's a key theme. Whenever probed to say how effective is your campaigning, the answer will be, well, look at the amount. And I think that's an issue for me.
Okay. My last question was going to be whether you could recount facts, but as you already told me that you don't want to do that, that is my last question. Thank you very much, Professor. There are no co-participant questions relating.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor. We've hardly touched the surface. You've obviously done a huge amount of work, for which I'm extremely grateful. But don't worry about the rest of your written material. We take into account all the evidence, not just the oral, the written as well. Okay. And I'm just sorry I won't have the time to pop along to Stirling and listen to a seminar or a lecture if you still give them. So thank you very much for your help.
Okay, thank you.
Right, I shall return at 1:25 to 2.